And over to our stars for today.
Okay, great. Well, what an amazing number of people here. There's such a wide range. We're really interested to see what comes up in the discussion afterwards. So Matty and I are doing a joint talk today. And we're going to talk about some work that we've been doing together. So I'll just come over here. Yeah, we've been collaborating for a while now in a number of different ways. And we're going to talk about a particular piece of work that we've been working recently, a paper. And we're also going to give you guys some reflections on interdisciplinary working, our experience of interdisciplinary working. So our collaboration began when Mark Hirons introduced us. I was doing research on equity of access to green space in Oxfordshire, which has since been published as this report. And Matty was on the MPhil in environmental change and management over at the School of Geography. At that point of time, I'm reading this out because this is what Matty said. I'll just read it out to go. Mostly interested in nature valuation aspect of nature. Then he realised that the story is very, very different when it comes to the urban environment. Conversations between us about my ongoing research and exposure to the work of the Oxfordshire Local Nature Partnership made Matty zoom in on the governance aspect of urban green space, and I agreed to be co-supervisor. So I did this report, which was published. Matty's done his MPhil, and then we've also collaborated. We applied for some funding. Matty's idea. We did an outreach event in a local neighbourhood all about urban access and to nature, art and nature, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. What we're going to focus on today is a paper that we've been working on. But first of all, why are we interested in this at all? Why would anyone care about urban green space and equity? But first of all, accessible green space. You'll hear me and Matty as well use this term a lot. What does it actually mean? Accessible green space. Well, first of all, green space is, I think of it, there are lots of fancy definitions, but any outdoor space that has pretty much natural surfaces. When we talk about accessible green space, that's green space that's freely open to the public, usually during daylight hours, and they don't have to pay to go in. So Oxford University Parks is locked overnight, but you can go in the day, you don't have to pay. There is an estate in the north of Oxfordshire where the landowner opens the gates for one day a year for the local community to come and walk, and that's not accessible green space. In this talk, however, we're also thinking about physical access beyond that simple measure of proximity, like can people get in? What barriers and enablers support people to use green space? I should say, we're not thinking about, I mean, of course, there's the physical access, as in do people have the physical ability to go, and thinking, we're not focusing on that. You'll see what we're talking about as we go through this. So examples of green space are, accessible green space are municipal parks, urban nature reserves, cemeteries can be included. There's a whole range of different green spaces, and blue space as well. When we talk about green space, we are meaning to include blue space. If you're lucky enough to live by the coast, then that would also be green space. So that's accessible green space, but why should we care about accessible green space? I'm not going into lots of detail here because I think everyone here is in this space, but of course there are well-established and increasingly researching the mechanisms, links between health, mental, physical well-being and spending time in and around green spaces. There's evidence that the most deprived communities sometimes have less access to green space. There's also evidence that more deprived communities actually benefit more from green space. So we've got these communities who are going to get more health and well-being benefits, and they really need that uplift if they're more socioeconomically deprived. They've got less of it, which is not a good situation to be in. So this is the context for the research that Matty and I have been doing. And we focus in Oxfordshire. Now this is really interesting. This is a graph from the Oxfordshire Public Health Director's annual report in 2020. But you don't need to worry about the words, but I hope you can see these coloured bars here, which indicate the percentage of households in income deprivation in the different districts of Oxfordshire. This is the average across Oxfordshire, the percentage of households that are deprived. Oh, sorry, this is the England level. This is Oxfordshire. So already, brilliant, Oxfordshire. on average, we're way above. We've got, sorry, it's the wrong way around. Sorry. Forgive me. I'm thinking that higher is better, but this is income deprived. Okay. So, you know, lots of income deprived people. Okay. Everyone stop laughing now. Okay, right. So we've got about, across England, there's just under about maybe 14% of households are income deprived. In Oxfordshire, it's more like 7.5%. It's brilliant, that's what we want. But unfortunately, this hides quite a lot of disparity. We have here the 15 most deprived wards in Oxfordshire, and here the 15 least deprived. So you can see that Oxfordshire might be thought of as a wealthy place, that we've got the Cotswolds, we've got Oxford University, there are these big pockets of deprivation. And that is the context for what we're looking at. And now I am going to hand over to Matty to talk about this paper that we are collaborating on.
Yeah, so that was basically the context on how we got to this point. And as Martha said, the collaboration is going on. The paper is almost there, so bear with us, you'll see it coming up hopefully soon. But this is the kind of title for the moment, which is Equity in Urban Green Spaces, Access and Governance. The critical importance of recognitional equity. So that's really the key word that we're gonna define slowly. And it's the kind of the hinge that brought us together. And if we go to the next slide, you'll probably understand why. Because when Martha and I started working together, we would talk about equity. And as we worked together, we realized we would define equity in very different ways. So the first point of context was, okay, how is equity understood out there? And why do we think of different things when, or speak different things when thinking about equity? So kind of giving an overview of these three equity dimensions that we usually talk about. And the first one is distributional equity, which just relates to the allocation of goods and bad or cost and benefits in society based on a socio-political arrangement or a policy or a scheme or whatever we're doing. And this is the kind of equity point that brought us together in the first place, right? So Martha was looking at the green space deprivation from a spatial perspective. So what are the neighborhoods that are socioeconomic deprived, but also green space deprived in terms of spatial distribution. The second dimension of equity is this procedural element, which looks more the inclusivity and the fairness of the way we come up to making a decision, right? How people get together within institutions and we make decisions. How fair and inclusive is that process? There's a third component, there's a third dimension in the equation that is usually kind of left out in mainstream equity talks. And this is the recognitional equity, which is quite mouthful, recognition of different experiences of socioeconomic deprivation, but also cultural heritage, and how those elements then shape at the same time very different dynamics on the procedural processes that we use, so the system that we use to get to final decision making, and the distributional impacts of those decisions in society. So that's kind of the overview, and that kind of brought us together to say, okay, this is a much bigger element of equity. When we talk about one equity, we can't just speak about one, but we need to be able to look at it more holistically, so all together. And then we wonder, okay, how does all of these apply to urban green space, which is exactly what we were interested in. And this is kind of the equity framework that we're using for the paper. So bear with me as I shed some light on it. So equity in urban green spaces is usually looked through the lenses of access and governance. And the first dimension, so access to green space, is usually looked through in terms of established lens of analysis, in terms of distributional equity, right? And we're saying how are these urban green spaces distributed, and in our case was within Oxfordshire, right? And where are those mostly green deprived pockets? The second element is on the governance side, is usually looked through procedural equity lenses, and this means assessing how inclusive or non-inclusive or how fair or unfair was the decision-making process to get around urban green space, management conservation and local planning at the neighborhood or city or county level, whatever kind of scale of analysis we're looking at. And again, there is the third level, the third dimension of equity, which is usually left out. And these kind of represent the novel lenses of analysis that we're taking and that were first proposed by Nesbitt et al. 2018. It was the first time where this kind of notion of recognitional equity was presented specifically in urban green space analysis. And basically what we're saying with with this framework is recognitional equity actually has an impact on both access and governance processes. So access to green spaces in the ways that we can't just assume that proximity is the only metric that will bring people closer to nature or closer to accessing more nature that is locally provided. But actually there's a range of needs, preferences, and values, if we want to kind of link to the value pluralist scholarship, as a way of saying actually people draw different values and look for different needs and preferences when accessing green spaces. And those make a huge difference in shaping their daily access to a green space. On the governance side of things, when we say it's not enough to give people an inclusive space for consultation or participation in a deliberative forum, what we need to understand is that A, we can assume that everyone is willing to do so, is willing to participate in the first place. B, we can't even assume that everyone comes from a place where they in fact can participate, even when a space of participation is offered to them. And basically this is exactly what I did then in the qualitative fieldwork with communities in Oxfordshire, but we'll get to it in a second. So this is the kind of equity lenses that we're taking. So yes, our research question was just briefly, how does recognitional equity shape understandings of urban green space access and governance? And just to fix on a kind of shared definition of recognitional equity, we want to define this as the recognition of different social groups' experience of socioeconomic deprivation and historic relation with institutions, including marginalizations, and how this shapes both access in urban green spaces and participation in the governance arrangement.
Oh yeah, so we've said that we're doing our research in Oxfordshire. Sorry, not Oxfordshire, Oxford. And this map shows you our 3 study sites in black. This is Oxford City. Each of these individual coloured areas is a small neighbourhood, an LSOA. I can tell you more about that afterwards, but it's just a small neighbourhood. And they are coloured according to the index of multiple deprivation decile that they're in. So ones that are bright yellow, that score 10, those are in the top 10% least socioeconomically deprived in England. So these are the really affluent places compared to all of England. Down here, number 1 is the 10% most deprived, in England. And we selected our 3 study sites to give a sort of a range of socioeconomic deprivation. So the first site was, the first area is Summertown St Margaret's. This is a ward in North Oxford. The median IMD decile is 10, so they're way up there. Very, very affluent neighbourhood. And in terms of governance, they have a neighbourhood plan, which is a formal type of plan that is made, to use by the people for the people. It's created by people locally, and then it feeds up into local plans, into higher level plans. Our second research area is Headington, the Headington Neighbourhood Forum area. This is slightly less affluent. It's got a median IMD decile of 9, but it's got a little bit more range. It's got some people down, some darker colours in there. And this also has a neighbourhood plan. In this case, they've set the area that the local community said that they wanted this plan. They've set the area that it covers. It's their plan. Our third area is Blackbird Leys down in the south of the city. The median IMD decile here is 2. So this is a very socioeconomically deprived area. Although there's a parish council, they have a regeneration plan, which is much more top down. There's been less community input to that. So these are our 3 study areas that we've been looking at. So, oh, I thought they were, okay, yeah. I thought they were all going to click up one by one, but it's all there all at once. Okay, so this is just a bit about the methods. I was doing the spatial analysis. You might have worked out by now that I'm the natural scientist and Matty is the social scientist. Yeah, so in terms of spatial analysis, I used publicly available data sets on green space provision to explore, using a number of different metrics, a number of different ways of thinking about green space, sort of quantify the green space deprivation in different areas. I'm not going to go into more details now because I've got a nice results slide where I'll talk to it, and I think it'll make a bit more sense seeing those images.
And then in the grey is the 2 methods. So in the fieldwork, qualitative fieldwork across these 3 communities for a total sample of 42 interviewees across the 3 study sites. And what I was doing, it was basically asking people to invite me and an artist coming with me for the implementation of a drawing-based method to basically invite us to take a walk in either very proxy green space close to their home or their favorite green space. And most of the case, people that tend to use green spaces locally would invite me to their favorite ones. People that were not used to going out in the locally provided green space, they would just pick the closest one to their home so they could do it as quickly as possible. And those tended to be also the more time deprived, and we'll get there. But basically these 2 methods both contributed to kind of shed some light on what are the socio and cultural considerations shaping people access to nature. So whether it's locally provided and beyond, just to reiterate that we're looking at kind of a wider conceptualization of access, not just by spatial proximity. And the drawing-based method was trying to capture, so interviewees during our walked conversation would get to a point where they would start narrating their ideal urban green space, or the ideal changes that they would like to see in the most accessible green space to them, for them then to kind of visit the space more. And there was an artist kind of capturing these and making lovely drawings, and we're kind of also working together to make some sort of art show of these drawings at some point, because I think there's lots more that could be done with it. But both of these, so the walked interviews would feed into the kind of thread of analysis of access, and the second one more on the governance side. So voicing the kind of change and how change can be realized through the institutions people would have access or not access to.
Great. So yeah, so those are the methods. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about what we've found. So here are our 3 study sites again, and as you can see, all the green areas are publicly accessible green space. So we have to find a way to say, well, okay, there's green space, but how do we quantify who's green space deprived? So the first thing that I did is Natural England have these accessible green space standards. They're called proximity size standards, and they say that in an ideal world, everyone should be within 200 metres of a green space that's half a hectare, within 300 metres of a space that's 2 hectares, and within 1 kilometre or a 15-minute walk of a 10-hectare space. And all of the green spaces, we've put buffers around them so you can see if you're in one of these white areas, you don't meet any of the standards at all, which is not cool. And at a really basic level, and I'm in between sort of updating the method that I'm using, and so I haven't quantified this particular element, but just at a really basic level, there's a lot more white space down in Blackbird Leys than there is in Summertown, and Headington is sort of intermediate. I do have some quantitative data for you, it's not just me pointing it aside and saying this. So the different elements, the quantitative elements that I've got are the accessible green space, just in terms of total hectares, how much green space is there in these different areas? The accessible green space in terms of metres squared per person, so the potential for overcrowding. You might have a lovely green space, but if it's the only one that everyone's in there, you're not going to have a very nice experience there, it's really crowded. Private gardens, of course these aren't accessible, but if you're in an area that has huge private gardens, then you might not need your green space, accessible green space so much, and vice versa. If you've got tiny gardens, you probably need more. If you haven't got much green space but big gardens, then it doesn't matter much. And then lastly, there's the mean percentage man-made surfaces in an area. And that is sort of, if you imagine, if everything's concreted over, of course you haven't got accessible green space, but you also, you know that you don't have verges and little pockets of green that might contribute to the overall feeling of being in a green area. So what we see in the dark green is Blackbird Leys, which was our most socioeconomically deprived area. We've got Headington in the middle, and we've got Summertown, the most affluent area. Accessible green space, Blackbird Leys has slightly more than Summertown. Headington's got the most. Then when we look at the accessible green space per person, Blackbird Leys is a much more densely populated community. So Summertown and in fact Headington have about a third more than Blackbird Leys. When we look at private gardens, again, there's a huge disparity in the amount of private gardens in hectares per 1,000 people. So there's loads more garden space in the more affluent areas. And then when we look at the mean percentage of man-made surfaces, Blackbird Leys has 42% man-made surfaces and Summertown 31. So there's a lot more just green space around in Summertown, the more affluent area, than in Blackbird Leys. And most of the time, Headington is sort of in the middle. You can sort of see that here in this graph as well. So yeah, what we've got is a very stark picture. Yes. Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry. Just a quick question. Is there a reason you didn't include the rivers? No?
Yes, okay, so the way that we include these in the updated version that I'm doing will be, so they don't get marked as green space usually, because it's like it's riverside access. So there's a data set that gives you like the kilometres of waterside access, like public rights of way that go alongside them, and I will be including those in the next iteration of this methodology that I'm working on. Yes.
That's a question. So the green spaces that don't have a buffer zone around them, is that because of the size of them, or?
Yeah, they're less than half a hectare. They're just tiddly.
But there's one there that looks like.
This one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to go back and look at that because that is a complete anomaly.
Okay. Sorry. I didn't
Yeah. I know. I just yeah.
So
I don't know.
that's the graveyard on Church County Road.
Okay. Okay, so that's, thank you. That's really helpful. So now I can answer the question. Thank you. Okay, so I've used publicly accessible green space, but the buffers are applied to a subset of that data. So things like cemeteries aren't included here because although green space are not spaces that are widely used, there's a widespread method. There's a established methodology from Natural England that explains all this. But thank you, that's together we've pieced that. Okay, right, and I will hand over to Matty now.
Yes, so, well, after the whole spatial analysis, we decided, okay, let's go talk to people on the ground across these three communities and see how they perceive their green space and what drive access to green spaces. And by speaking to this kind of value pluralistic approach to ecosystem services and valuation of green spaces, we kind of found that actually what changed across the deprivation level. So again, just for clarity, the low being the most deprived, the highest range being the non-deprived, so the top 20% actually here in this region. What changed across wasn't actually the values that people were mentioning they drawing when accessing green spaces, but was the meaning associated with those values. So the literature talks about this kind of culturality aspect of these cultural ecosystem services. So what makes a meaning of an ecosystem service or a benefit from accessing nature and in this case, green spaces. And these two are the two value categories, as I called them, that applied across all study sites, but with very, very different meanings and understandings from people on the ground or descriptions that people provided on the ground. And this sense of well-being that was linked to a sense of escape among people in Blackbird Leys was mostly mentioned and voiced through an escape from financial and quite material worries of a daily life. And there will be some quotes just to kind of draw your attentions on these differences. Among mid-decile, people between in Headington and Summertown as study areas, named this sense of escape towards or in relation to quite a busy daily professional life that brings them like statically behind the laptop or a desk. And among very non-deprived people, this element of escaped almost became a sensorial experience. It was brought down to an aesthetic value of nature as a way of a visual break from the built-up environment of the city. So again, very different meanings, but speaking to the same type of value and benefit that they're drawing out of accessing green spaces. And in terms of access extra space, or this value category described by them as openness, among the most deprived, it was very interesting to kind of draw this correlation and understand that what they meant by more space is to be seen in relation to a very usually overcrowded domestic space. So some interviewees really named the kind of need of a park nearby, so to escape a 2-bedroom flat lived by 9 people of the same family. Then among mid-decile, the access to extra space was mostly linked to activities that people cannot enjoy in the private domain. So playing baseball because you need a much bigger space than your private garden, or swimming, so in Catterslow, accessing the canal that is available there, and which is something that they can, again, offset in the domestic environment. And again, this aesthetic component among the least deprived people came again in terms of openness. When voicing the access to more space, they were in fact voicing this ability of seeing the vista, and this is a term used by 3 interviewees there. It's not an Italian term that I borrowed from my language. It is to say people were naming this vista, and actually very interestingly, a guy was trying to describe this meaning of the vista and access to the extra space that they can see in the sky. And he used the term or the word vista because it reminded him of an old house that he grew up in Tuscany, being able to see these hills and these big skies changing seasonally. So yeah, no, perfect. And this is just to say, so this is kind of the 2 outputs from interviewees in Summertown that couldn't access baseball and swimming. So exactly the 2 examples that were on the previous slide, and access or drone to access green space, in this case, Catterslow Park, Catterslow and Sunnymead, so that they can access amenities there or activities that they wouldn't be able to do in the private domain. Which is instead in contrast with the experience of Blackpool Leeds people. I'm just going to read quickly the 2 quotes. So first interview is speaking on that kind of well-being and sense of escape from material and financial worries, says, the life I live now with 3 kids and mortgage, looking at the bills that come on top of everything else, is just hard and hectic. So I come here, and we're talking about Spindleberry Nature Park, to find some peace to mind. You need that time and space to just zone out. So it's really that kind of well-being element linked to what they go on our daily life. And the second guy, speaking from a kind of mental health recovery process that is just completed, says, it was really important for my well-being because I was suffering from my clinical depression and anxiety. I was very isolated and confined to my house, but the fact that I could come find a sort of a tranquil space in nature was really important. I spent time over the other side as well, where the fields are, and I can walk up. But unfortunately, that's all going to build on as well. Just houses, that was a really important part of my recovery. And this is really key, and I put the emphasis here, because this is the kind of storytelling we're trying to give, the story we're trying to give through the paper on what's been happening in Blackwell Leeds because of this detachment, of this lack of participation from local people in shaping local plans and what's happening locally. So this guy is talking about a field that is now being given for development under the set regeneration plans from the City Council. So on the governance side of things, we inquired again across these 42 people whether they were able to participate in consultative or deliberative forums, mostly being either the neighbourhood forum in Summertown and Headington, and then City Council or County Council consultations, and the willingness to participate with the same sort of kind of local planning provision in Blackburn Leeds, with the only difference that, again, they have consultation for the regenerations plans and they don't have a neighbourhood plan driven by the residents. What we found is that among the most deprived in Blackburn Leeds, yes please, two drivers, like 2 barriers for them to participate were quite striking. There was a whole range, but you know, when it comes to qualitative, it was quite an inductive process. So these tended to be, at the end of the day, the 2 biggest barriers that people face on the ground. The first one being, not surprisingly, the cost of time. It's really hard for people that are socioeconomically deprived with a whole series of responsibility to find time just to show up to a public meeting, pick up the leaflet and respond to a survey or to an online consultation that the city or county council are having. And we're talking about, in particular, this regeneration plan consultation that started in 2019 and just finished when I was actually doing data collection. And the second thing is quite an important element, actually, is the, I call it here, capacity to self-organize formally for the system. But what I mean is basically the type of social organizing that different communities and different social groups had. So in Summertown and Headington, it's really easy for people to get together, find the time and expertise to respond formally to the consultative process for a new building, for the local plans and stuff like that. In Blackburn Leeds, actually, because there's a much more ethnic diversity, what happens is people tend to gather together based on trusted networks of collaboration and sharing information or value negotiation processes. So this formal consultative process can't quite capture what's been discussed in a much more informal, network-based way of organizing society. In terms of what drives the willingness or unwillingness to participate is, thank you, is how they feel during this consultation. So it's a way of saying even when they are able and willing to participate, they get there and they tend to perceive the whole process as an unmeaningful engagement from institutions. And that, as you can imagine, drives a set of mistrust towards institutions that drive people even more politically marginalized than included in the process. So this is kind of the storytelling of these practical barriers for them to being able and willing to participate, which is summarized, I guess, then in our policy implications. The first one is not surprising, it's quite established in the literature and is the one pack doesn't fit all. So we can assume that just by giving an extra green space in a socioeconomically deprived area, that would result in an increase of access, so an increase of local people using and accessing green spaces locally provided. And the contrast with Headington in this case was quite helpful, I must say. Headington came up as a best practice or best standard for this kind of multifunctional approach to park management. So they're able to retain a variety of spaces that speak to very different needs, life stages. So from the very purely sport recreational ground up until the wild character of nature in Shotover or Berry Noble Park that brings them together. And also the ecological connectivity. I call it here ecological. The way actually people on the ground voiced it was through their ability to walk from Maston or Headington down to the city centre just by going through green spaces, which is a fascinating thing that I didn't know about Oxford before. The second being, we can apply the same message of the one pack doesn't fit all to the kind of consultation strategies or deliberative forums that we take, and we can assume that, again, everyone or each social groups we're intending to, make inclusive space for can respond to one type of consultation strategy. And someone from Summertown really encapsulated this and says hours and hours of time that people give voluntarily to develop neighborhood plans. You didn't get there unless you're in an area like Summertown, where you've got well-educated retired people, mostly from Oxford University, with time on their hands, quite frankly. They can figure out the way through the system, and it's ridiculous to say that this is the provision for England because it's just not happening. How many people have the luxury of time to do that? And that's something interesting because they are quite active in local planning, but actually they are quite time deprived at the same time. So they see why the availability of time on local and fellow residents in the area then actually make a difference in voicing the whole community, like the community as a whole. And the contrast I wanted to give is from a guy who's become very active in quite recently, exactly for this kind of perceived injustice towards these regeneration plans on Knights Road development sites. And they say they, in the parish council, felt very poorly served by the city council over what's happened in this development. So this is the planning application for everyone who's interested to have a look at the map. They ended up paying for a planning consultant to basically interpret and giving them the summary on how good or bad this was. And they, the parish councillors, have never been against development, but the conclusion of the consultant was that this development wasn't in fact serving the locals. Yet, because they couldn't follow up the action with this legal person, with this consultant, and formulate a formal response to the consultation, that development has actually been granted permission now. And we have one last takeaway, which is kind of what Martha and I want to leave you out of the talk, is how intertwined the access to green space and the participation of the same people we're trying to increase or improve access for in governance arrangements deciding, so the deliberative forums about these green spaces are. And we shouldn't be looking at, we do that in the paper for the sake of the literature, because there's some literature that speaks only about access and some literature that kind of concerns only with the governance side of things, but it's really understanding how intertwined these two are. And I think the case in Blackburn shows this clearly. And again, I'm going to paraphrase these two because they're quite long, but the development site on Knights Road is basically now eroding those very values that were bringing people closer to nature in the first place, because now there's a whole development site, people are unable to see deers, Manchak witnessed the birds. The heron has gone from the pond, nowhere to be seen in the last 12 months since they started the development. So all those kind of elements that were driving actually people closer to nature and would have a positive impact on well-being are now being eroded. And linking back to what Martha was saying in terms of the built-up environment, or the
man-made surface.
The man-made surface,
Yeah.
thank you, the technical terminology there. What's been happening is that there are these informal patches of green between houses in Blackbird Leys, and they're shrinking because some of them are already being given for development. But what's been happening is that the new houses come without any parking space provision, because it's part of the regeneration plans to have to work towards the net zero strategy of the council, right? So what's been happening, in fact, is that the new tenants need to be able to park the car somewhere, have been taking over these informal patches of green spaces that are between the houses. And I mean, I've taken a photo because it's quite striking. The guy says that 2 to 3 years ago, kids would play here, would be able to play here, and the local community would value immensively, because people living in this flat would be able to still keep an eye on the kids playing on these patches. And they wouldn't trust them, instead sending them to Spindleberry Nature Park, which is the biggest park in the middle of the 2 city woods that make the parish council area. And basically what's happening is that kids can't play on these fields anymore because they are usually car parked, and when they're not car parked, they have become very poorly and so they're managed, so you would probably not leave your kid playing there. And at the same time, they're not able to visit Spindleberry Park because there's a sense of antisocial behavior linked to that space, which is too far from home. I think we're here. Yes.
Yes.
So it's basically saying the potential of thinking recognitional equity when thinking about equity of access and governance is not an easy job to do, and I think the literature stresses that quite a lot. But there's definitely momentum or opportunity to make sure that top-down urbanization, like in the case of regeneration plans, that are still happening all across England, because that's the provision from the national government to level up the most deprived communities, don't kind of, you know, lead to a whole set of unintended consequences, given from this very gap between local planning that comes from the top and what people value or need and would prefer on the ground. And the same thing, the literature talks about more on green gentrification effects, but it was interesting to see how these consequences usually linked to green gentrification in Blackbird Leys are simply applied because the green space provision is in fact shrinking. Crazy enough, it's shrinking.
So that's a sort of that we're writing up this paper at the moment. We're trying to bring together our social sciences and natural sciences thing into to get this to get our messages across. And yeah, we're working on that at the moment. But we also wanted to give you to tell you a little bit about a project that we did in Blackbird Leys back in November, funded by the ESRC Social Sciences Festival. Yeah, so we had an afternoon workshop, free for members of the local public, and we worked with local community organisers to make sure that the venue and the time, yes,
the African Caribbean Multicultural Association.
Yeah, so we made sure that we were organising an event that would be as accessible as possible to the local community. And we really wanted to share our research findings with them, and also give people who are interested in nature locally a chance to sort of get together and enjoy the activities that we're putting on, but just share with each other and chat. So the activities were this fab art opportunity like collage making, nature collage making, which was designed and run by Harmon, who was the artist in the walked interviews. We had kids getting involved, we had grown-ups getting involved, yeah, including Joe Boyle out there. It wasn't all people from Oxford University.
Well, these are the ones we could give permission to be on the board.
So that was really great. People enjoyed that. We had food and drink, so people could sit down and chat, and people stayed a long time, didn't they?
Yeah.
And I'd never done any participatory mapping before, so none of this wasn't a research event. This was just to give back and for us to get some experience and to speak to people locally. And it was really great. We asked people to mark up maps of the local area to say what they liked about their local green spaces. what was interesting is, of course, we got negative things. Those comments about the parking on the little bits of green came up, and all sorts of other things. Really interesting to make the research we've done, certainly for me, because I hadn't been down doing the walked interviews, really made it sort of come to life, hearing people's everyday concerns about their green spaces. So it was really great to be able to give that back to the community. We had, what, 20, 30 people come down?
Yeah, quite good. Some local councillors coming down, and I think that's like the interesting thing is how this event became the kind of the trigger for the Spindleberry Nature Park to be reformed. So now residents have picked up that as a message, and they want to do something to get together and try to manage the park better or protect it better from the local plans being redeveloped at the county level. And I think it's been helpful for them because they're in the process of trying to develop a neighbourhood plan despite the resource scarcity that they face.
Yeah, and we shared a summary of our, what sort of came out of this with the parish council.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's sort of feeding into local governance as well. And finally, just a few reflections on the interdisciplinary working. We've been working together, gosh, it's well over a year now, isn't it? And I think we're increasingly understanding each other. But yes, I'll click through. I think you're first.
Yes, well, I mean, nothing new, but keep your knowledge accessible. It was a great learning curve to start talking to Martha, high technical, social and sciencey level, and then her panicking and saying, no, you need to start again. Talk to me like you were talking to a kid, and vice versa for the equality side of things. So I would look at her map and be, what is going on here? What are these maps telling us? So I think that is definitely key. Like, no matter how technical, just make it accessible, or try to make it accessible for the other person. Yeah, for both. Yes, and it is time to say, like, the time and energy we spend in making sure each other could understand what each other was doing was of course time consuming in the moment, and we worked with deadlines. I was on my MPhil, a lot going on, but the long-term reward, like being able then to go back to that work and like think further interdisciplinary work together, definitely pays you off. And if it's not in the direct collaboration that you're going through at the moment, it will be with the next person and the next group and so forth.
And yeah, sort of just similar, I said don't underestimate the challenges. It has been time consuming. It's not quick and easy, but also the rewards. It's been getting things like new perspective on research. I think there's a richer, broader understanding of the questions that I'm looking at. Yes, as I said myself, a richer, broader research. Yeah, richer, broader research outcomes and impacts as well. If we hadn't been collaborating, I think the impacts of my research would be very different. And doing this interdisciplinary research, we'll be able to speak to more people about what we're doing, which is very exciting. So yeah, just thanks to all these people, and thanks to you guys for listening. Any questions?
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I think it's such important work. Early on in the talk, you spoke about distributional, procedural, and recognitional equity. And I wondered if a fourth thing came to mind, and I wondered if you'd count this in recognitional or something separate. But it's sensory equity of the senses, because we all engage with green spaces through our bodies. And I've been working with an ecologist on the effects of hearing loss on your ability to perceive birdsong and kind of connect with nature through sound. And one of the things that's really just blown my mind from this work is how stark the differences can be in how audible the natural world is for different people. So like birds that sing at really high frequencies, like goldcrests or bluesits, even at a few meters away, become inaudible for people with quite a lot of hearing loss. But you can still hear them maybe 200 meters away if you're quite young. And so even if one can access green spaces in an urban context, if you're significantly deaf, then your ability to experience it hasn't necessarily changed so much. And there are a couple of things that came to mind as ways to address that. One is hearing aids, and there's a really beautiful study from a year ago which looked at the ability of hearing aids to restore like your experience of being in green spaces, but also how people who took part in the study didn't realize all of the sounds of green spaces that had been missing until they had it restored. But also different hearing aids vary a lot in their quality depending on price. So that's like an intersection of like socioeconomic inequality and sensory deprivation. So yeah, I wondered if you felt like the role of the senses is part of recognitional inequity, or do you feel like it? And did it come up in the conversations that you had with people that, yeah.
Super interesting. Thanks for the question. Should I address that? I don't know if you want to say anything on the ecology of beds and being able to.
No, I was just going to say that I think that we talked about physically accessing spaces, but I think it goes beyond just sensors. I mean, you know, that whole sort of, is it suitable for wheelchair users and things like that? There's a whole,
Yeah,
I guess this is slightly
as well.
different, but yeah, there's a whole piece that we haven't addressed, but I'm interested to hear where you think it would.
It's super interesting. I mean, I've never heard or defined this sensorial equity per se, but I guess it's part in our idea, it's part of that process of recognition. So actually recognize it. And I know we focus like heavily because that was the kind of context we were in terms of socioeconomic deprivation. The kind of ethnic aspect of it, or the biocultural diversity of it, came up a bit more in Blackbird Leys because it is objectively much more biodiverse and culturally diverse. But in terms of this sensoriality, I guess it's like if we had much more informal ways of engaging people and fostering these deliberative forums in a much more flexible way, or people-centered or centric way, I guess these range of needs would be more likely to come up, and also the intersection of, as you were saying, socioeconomic deprivation with a wider range of distributional inequities that are there, or contextual inequities, if you want to call them that way. So I guess the final message of the talk was make sure you talk to everyone before, or at least the people that are there, before deciding what to do about with a green space, right? So if we knew there was an affluent area with people with hearing impairment, like, you could make those considerations, but they wouldn't be captured in mainstream consultative processes or deliberative forums. And this is the kind of problem we want to push up the front. It's like rethink the strategies for the city council, the county council, whatever is making that top-down decision, to open those consultations and actually look at recognizing these differences and how better can be accommodated. So yeah, the sensoriality of things, again, came up only in Summertown, which was quite interesting to hear, how people would speak about this kind of well-being effect from a very sensorial perspective, right? Again, being able to see birds that they haven't seen in a while, or being able to see the green and how the green changes across season or seasonal change. Something that didn't come up with, or not as much with people in Blackbird Leys. And I always wondered, I haven't got down to it, I didn't get my head around it, but I always wonder if that perception on much more material constraints and life worries that you kind of get relief when accessing green space drives you farther away from the sensorial, or the sensoriality just becomes, you know, a medium for you to feel better about other things. So it was less stressed in the verbal side of the conversation, if you may.
That's so interesting, thank you.
I think John at the back had his hand up first. Sorry,
You do this, you've been to ask.
Just a couple of points, and just to love to hear your thoughts. But one of them is the gentrification issue. There's obviously a temptation to turn all deprived areas into Summertown, and then we have a housing shortage in this country, so poor people will just get pushed out. The whole thing gentrified. That thing. So it's almost as though less affluent areas need a better standard of planning than the more straightforward affluent areas. How do you maintain an area that has low cost housing, therefore smaller housing, probably a higher element of social housing, and yet it doesn't have to be run down, it doesn't have to be unhealthy. But that requires more input than something like just building a load of big posh houses in Summertown. And how do you get that when, as you pointed out at the beginning, poorer people are not seen and not heard? The second point, just to cheer a flag, really, it's not really a question, but your point about making your science accessible. No, you said keep it accessible. It's almost like hold it back, keep it down. I would just, for all of us, I think the aspiration is to make it accessible. I think anybody who truly understands their work, that the biggest mark of that is be able to express it in a couple of short sentences of plain English.
Gentrification, there's a paper that I don't think I actually read, but the title was like, how do you avoid over gentrification? You know, how do you gentrify but not gentrify? And I think it probably comes down to a lot of it governance, but I'm sure also like local policies, the local plan, which obviously has to take into account local governance, but I think you need top down and bottom up for that.
Yeah, I think that's really the key to look at, or at least in what came up in this study. It was really like a double multi-level pressure. So you have this kind of bottom-up provision where residents would in fact ideally need their inputs. But because of all the kind of constraints that they face, that voice is not quite captured from the top level that is drafting those regenerations plan and deciding what's going to happen locally. And of course, throwing the consultation out there, because that's a procedural, so it's a legal requirement for the county or the city council to run that type of consultation. But then understanding that by setting up 3 meetings at 3 p.m. for that specific demographic is not enough for them to leave or to form that voice and bring it up in a problematic way. I think that's what drives and maintains this gap in gentrification processes. And there's Nesbitt et al. 2023, which speaks about these very problems specifically. So this was the first guy that problematized this element of recognitional equity and how or what kind of difference it can make in driving unintended consequences of gentrification and green gentrification. And in 2023, so later than producing this kind of framework, he also brought up the problem on, okay, we now have a conceptual framework to look at this, but then it's really hard to put it into practice for policymakers when it comes to deliberative processes, but also for green practitioners to kind of keep in mind when planning the next green space, also for the housing. And the difference between Summertown and Blackwell Leys is not in fact that they face different types of development. Definitely they face these different types of